Okay, in this video I'm going to show you how you can write your own custom code in C# to do some of the things that we were looking at in the prior video could have been done with XML helper. Why you might want to do that is, with custom code you have more control, and the example I'm going to use is adding a group node. So let's look at our schema again just to review. So we took the loan process schema here called case XSD from the loans processor SDK, and in prior videos I made quite a few changes to it. One of the changes I made was I added this little repeating group called assets, and then you can own several assets, and each asset can have a name and a value. So what if we wanted to create a business rule that created new assets? Okay, so again, it's kind of a contrived example, but it'll show you how this code works. So I already off of the video I've written the code to do this, and I put it in the BizTalk Common Training library here. And so what I want to look for here is the BRE helpers, and then I've created this routine, public static void. It's not returning anything. It's called add asset, and it's receiving the typed XML document, and then we're going to pass it the asset name and the asset value, which correspond to the two items in our schema here. Asset name, which is a string, and asset value, which is a decimal. So every time we call this routine, what it should do is add a new asset to the assets node. So I'm going to walk you through the code here. This is basically just using XML doc and DOM and XPath to be able to manipulate your XML document. So we start off by just creating a variable called node name, which we might use here in a minute. We're going to create XPath, and I'm going to find the root node. And the reason I'm doing this is, let me show you here. Suppose assets was actually down a deeper node. Suppose it was root, and then suppose we had something called assets and liabilities, and under that we had assets. So what I want to make sure is that the assets and liabilities node already exist. In this case, I don't have that in between node, so I'm just going to make sure that the root node exists, which of course it's going to exist, but anyway, this is what I'm trying to show. So this may not be the root node, it may be an intermediary node, and I want to see if it exists. So I build the XPath, I then say XML node, whatever I call it, and say locate XPath, which is my own internal routine, which I'll show you in just a minute. I pass the typed XML document, and then I pass the XML root. And if it exists, it will not be null. So if it does not exist, I throw an exception, and I basically say, before this piece of code can run, that node must exist. So let's take a little peek at this routine here. I'm going to say go to definition, and there are two of them. One works with the typed XML document and one with the regular XML document. It's just a few lines of code. It basically, first of all, peels off the node from the XML document, and then if that returns a null, it says if parent equals null, if this is null, we're going to return null from the routine. So this returns an XML node, and so if what we pass in is null, what we pass back is null. And then it says, is there an XPath specified? If not, return the parent. So here, if I pass an XPath string that's not null, I want to return the parent node, which is basically the entire XML chunk there. And then, so if that's null or it's empty string or null, then I return the same thing that got passed back. But if XPath is not null, I basically run the XPath, and then I return, so it says parent dot select single node. I return the first node we find that has that XPath, and it also uses the namespace manager. Okay, so now I'm going to back up here to our routine. So we were in the add asset routine, and we just threw this error if the intermediate or root node was not found. Now I'm going to look for the assets node. So we're going to build an XML document. We turn this preserve whitespace to true so that this C# doesn't actually change the way your XML is shaped. We then get the owner document. We check to make sure that the root there is not null. And now we check for the node assets. and it says this node is required. However, if it's not there, we'll just add it for you. So if we're going to find this assets, so we're going to say assets node is equal to that locate XPath. If it's null, this is the code to insert it. So we're going to create a new node called assets. The node name will be assets. XML element, new asset node, and we're going to say root.create element and then the node name. And then you have to append that child into the existing group. And then after we do that, we're going to repeat this statement right here so that when we exit out of here, this asset nodes will be pointing to exactly where it was. In other words, we find the asset node and then we either continue, or if we don't find the asset node, we add it and then we set the reference to it back to what we just added. Hope that's not too confusing. Okay, so now we're going to create a new node called asset, and we're going to follow the same steps we did right here. We're going to create root.create element node name 2, which is asset, and then we're going to append that child into the existing asset node that we already have. Okay, now we're going to add the two children. So we have an asset. An asset should have an asset name and an asset value. So we have two chunks of code here that basically repeat the same type of logic again, and this time I'm getting the value from the parameters str and dec decimal. So let's look at string asset name. If I scroll back, these are the two variables I pass, my asset name and my asset value. So ultimately the two children that we're adding at the bottom here will create the element, and then we'll set the value of that element to the params that were passed to us. Inner text is a string, and so I'm going to take my decimal value and convert it back to a string before I put it in the inner text. So that's basically how you add elements to XML. Now, how do we test that? I created a console unit tester here in the same solution. So here's my common library, and here's my unit tester, and let's go look at the unit test code. So the unit tester code has to have references to these special type libraries so we can get the TXT documents. And what I'm going to do is say this is the file I want to read in, which is basically a long file name, but it's sample loan 2. Okay, and then I'm going to do an XML document load on that. Then I'm going to wrap it with a typed XML document, because remember, business rules always pass typed XML documents. So when I wrote the asset helper routine here called add assets, I had to receive a typed XML document. So the unit tester then has to wrap the XML document with the typed XML document. The way you do that is you call this constructor. The first variable is the document name, which you could just make up anything for purposes of this test. The second parameter then is the XML document itself. Then I'm going to call that helper routine called add asset, and I'm going to add a condo worth $99,000 and a doghouse worth $2,000. I then that's going to return to me this TXT variable. And so now, to save it to disk, I have to create an XML document out of the typed XML document. So one way to do that is you just do a load XML out of the outer XML of the document that's in the typed XML document. It seems like a long way to do it, but it works. Then I'm going to save that back to disk, and I'm going to save it in the same directory name of my input file, except I'm going to change the file name to sample loan add asset out. And then I'm going to run that. And by the way, my common library was in the GAC, so now that I'm changing it, I had to delete it from the GAC in order to test this. And so I have really no console out here, so I just go to the directory we were working with, and this is my sample loan add asset out. We scroll down and we see the two assets that I coded, condo and doghouse, with the respective prices. So that's kind of cool. Two more tests we should probably do. So we should take our sample file here, copy it, and paste it, and call it sample loan 3 maybe. And then let's edit that. So what if we didn't have any assets at all here? Remember we said in our code that even if assets, plural, doesn't exist, we want to add it. So we're going to delete all of the assets, save this, and we'll go back to my unit test code, make a couple of minor changes. So here in the file name, I now want to put sample loan 3, and I'll call this loan 3 out, and I'll do debug start. Okay, it runs really fast, and then we go back here and look at sample 3 out, and notice it still worked. We got our 2 assets that we added, condo and doghouse. Okay, so now we need to put that back in the GAC. So we go to Windows Assembly here, and my source is going to be bin debug. So back in the GAC. And now if I want to, in the business rule, I can now add an asset. So again, this is kind of a contrived example. Which policy do I want to put it in? I need to go back to this version 1.3 here, copy it, paste, and we'll create a new rule here called add new assets. And we'll give this a 1 = 1 type of logic so that we'll always add these assets. And then now we need to add the actions. So the actions are going to be in our C# helper class here. We've changed it and we've regacked it though, right? So we're going to have to reopen the business rule composer to pick up the new version of that C# gacked program. Okay, I've reopened the composer and I've reopen the policy that we were working on. I now want to go browse and find my common library right here. And now if I go to BRE helpers, we should see add asset. I can drag it down here. The TXT document needs to be my loan schema. I picked the case XSD schema, the one that I've modified since we've been working on this. I now just drag and drop the case XSD on the TXD here, and then the asset name can be rental unit 1, and that's 50,000. And then let's do it again. Let's go back to .NET classes, add another asset. So we'll call this rental unit 2. It's 120,000, and I need to put my TXD, so I go back to my schemas and drag that case. So now I'll save this, publish and deploy. Okay, so we've modified a business rule. To make sure that our orchestration sees that, I'm going to restart the host instance. And then we're going to go back and run the same orchestration that we've been running a few lessons back, which is the loan processing orchestration. So I can take sample loan 2 and go to the input directory and paste it. Then we're looking at the output directory. I'll probably take 15 seconds here, so let me pause. Okay, I waited a little while, and here is my new file on March 17th. I open that file, and we see my original primary residence and my 3 summer homes, and now we see my 2 rental units that I've now added to my assets. So that's pretty cool. So just to recap what we've learned in this video, we went to Common Library, and in our BRE helpers routine, we created our own custom code called add asset. and we passed two values of the asset. And of course, if you have an element that had 10 values, you could have 10 values here. And the key was to pass the typed XML document first. And then we just used regular XML document manipulation here to add and create new nodes and new elements inside that document given certain XPath expressions. And then ultimately we set the value of the asset name to the value I passed, and then we did the same thing for the value of the asset to some numeric value, which was the decimal asset value. Then we wrote a C# console helper program to test this. When you write this custom code, it is going to be, a little buggy at first, right? So you test it outside of BizTalk using just C# to C#. And then you create maybe 4 or 5 or 10 test files. You test them all and make sure it's working before you even think about moving this code into BizTalk Business Rules. Then we went to the Business Rule Composer. We created a new copy of our policy version. We added a rule called Add New Assets that always runs, and in that, when this condition is true, I have two actions, and that was to add 2 rental units. Now, what we used to use this for in the real world was kind of back to this global schema I was talking about before. We had what was called an itinerary. We built an ESB, an Enterprise Service Bus, and the itinerary was determined by the business rules. So we would have a master policy which would then call other policies, and those policies could add steps to the itinerary. And an itinerary might say, if we received a loan, I want you to do A, B, and C. And then some other step might run and say, well, I need you to do step D and E. And so the itinerary could basically grow, but it was totally determined by the business rules. And so that's one way to think kind of abstract and generic, and how you could have a super common message and have the itinerary driven entirely by these business rules. So that concludes this video.